Right. So we'll be going with visitor patterns. So this slide, this presentation is mainly about how to use them, when to use them, and how to implement it. Right. So first, what is visitor pattern? Well, visitor pattern allow us to separate unrelated algorithms operating on some data structure, right? So here, if you look at the UML diagram, you have one element, right? And then you have like one element interface, and then you have two concrete elements, the concrete element A and B, which implements that element interface. And then you want to do some operations on them, right? So each related operations can go to a separate visitor. So concrete visitor 1, concrete visitor 2, which have the same kind of interface. Okay, this is very abstract at the moment, but let's try to replace element with maybe file hierarchy, right? So elements are like files. It could be a folder or file or some kind of node in that file hierarchy. And visitor, suppose you want to perform some operations on that whole file hierarchy, and you want to know maybe the total size of that folder, right? So you will give a folder, right? And then you would have multiple files in that. So the visitor will be calculating file size. So it will go to each file and calculate a file size. So this is one kind of visitor. Another visitor that you could have is maybe a summary visitor or something similar to that. So what summary visitor will be doing will it will be going to each file and will be getting its stats like what when was it last edited, like who is the owner of that file, which group it belongs to, and at the end it will create a report saying these are the files which were touched most recently, and these are the users and how many files this user have, right? So those kind of things can be done through visitor pattern. Okay, now question is when to use it, right? So the first most prerequisite of using a visitor pattern is that your object, the structure of that object should rarely change. So in your file and folder, we know our file system is kind of pretty constant. Like we know we only have files and folder. We don't have like new kind of nodes, certainly, right? The structure is very constant, right? But suppose if you are working on some project where the internal structure changes a lot, right? Maybe you're experimenting with it, right? Then it's not a good idea to use visitor, because as soon as the structure or the file like the element hierarchy changes, you have to implement like you have to change all the visitors that you have implemented. So better to do it for some things that rarely changes. So things like your language AST, like once the language have reached a stable point like 1.0, it will have a fairly stable AST, which will not change often. And then public API, right? So whatever a request your public API takes or response it gives, you can implement visitors on them, because public APIs rarely changes. Okay, if your object changes very often, like you're working on some new project and maybe a new API, and it's not made public yet, right? So it's better to for each of those API, better to have its own method separately instead of taking it out. Okay, the second thing is when objects are not uniform. So suppose if your objects are uniform, in a sense that suppose if you only have list of files and no folders, right? Then it's better to use iterator. It is more simple uh, to use iterator comparatively instead of using visitor. Okay, and third is if you have unrelated operation that depend on same structure. So that's the main use case of visitor pattern. So in the previous example, we had like file structure, right? And the file size and the other summary like user permission, visitor. Those are like two different operations. So all the file size related operation can go to file size visitor, and all the user permission information can go to user permission visitor, right? And all of these things can be separated out. The structure will stay same, like file and folder, that hierarchy will stay different, but the stats, these all unrelated stats that you have, they can go to different visitors. And if you want to just change the file size visitor, you can change only that, and you don't have to touch any of the other visitors. Okay, Other example is like suppose you have some AST, right, and you abstract syntax tree of some program, right, and you want to do some analysis. In Go, we have unused variable error, right, or some unreachable code, right? So that can be done. So suppose you have AST, and these all analysis can be different visitors. So you can have unused variable visitor and unreachable code visitor. These all kind of visitors you could have, and you could have another visitor for formatting the code. So it will take input as your raw text, the AST, and it will pretty print it, or it will format it in correct way. So these are few examples when you can use a visitor. Okay. So there are some consequences of using visitor, right? So first is benefit is like adding new operation is easy. Like adding a new visitor, you could easily add a new file size visitor, or maybe if you wanted to have a different visitor for your whole file hierarchy, you could do it easily. Just you have to implement a new visitor. You don't have to touch any of the existing visitors, right? The second one is all the related behavior is in one place, right? That is its visitor, and all the unrelated one, maybe like unrelated for the file size, unrelated one would be permission, right? It will go to different visitor. So all the unrelated will become separate visitors, and all the related things will be implemented in that one visitor. Okay. And third is visiting different class hierarchies. So if you have heterogeneous class, right, like different class collection, right, like you could have files and folders, right, you better to use visitor. But if you only have files, then you could go for iterator. That's more easy. Okay. Accumulating state. So suppose for the file size, right, it have to keep track of how much size it have encountered till now. So there it's better, like visitor allow us to keep some internal state in its visitor. So you can accumulate informations while visiting all the nodes, and you can maybe use it at later point of time. Some of the disadvantages, adding a new element is very difficult. So that's why, suppose you have a visitor already implemented, and as soon as you derive a new element out of it, that visitor won't work on that new element, because to make it work on that new element, you have to change all the visitors. You have to add a visit function for that specific new element hierarchy that you have added. So suppose you have file and folders, and suppose in some random scenario you add a uh, maybe like printer into that hierarchy, and as soon as you add it, uh, you would have to like change all the visitors. File hierarchy now will accept a printer, right? But if you don't do it, then you will get compile time errors in your visitor, because if somebody, or runtime exception, because if somebody calls visit while by taking a printer, right, it will get an exception because that method is not available. It's not implemented for all of those visitors, right? Okay. And six is breaking encapsulation. So using visitor breaks encapsulation because the visitor have to know internal state of the element. It have to know how, where, which variable stores the file size, right? So that have to be broken so that visitor can do something functional. Got it. So let's go for implementation details. In all the some new dynamic languages like Clojure and C Sharp, they support double dispatch. And if you have double dispatch, you could implement visitor very trivially. What you need, so suppose in here, like we have an example here. So suppose you have a item class, right, item interface, which have two subtype, that is activity and messages, right, and then you have format PDF and XML. So what this visitor will allow us, suppose you want to export all of your activity or user feed and messages to some format. It can be exported to PDF or XML. So if you have double dispatch, you can check the type of item and format, and based on that, if you can say, okay, I have activity in PDF combination, so activity to PDF export you can do, or activity to XML. But in languages like Java, where you only have single dispatch available,
what you would have to do is like you have to create visit function for each of these items. So suppose here you can take a look at the example, like you have a item class and then you have two messages and message and activity which extends the item. And if you look at the visitor, you have to write visitor which are using both of those, activity and message, so it's using overloading. For languages which doesn't support overloading, you would have to write visit activity and visit message, so that it can differentiate between them because it doesn't have any overloading. But if you have overloading, you can work with only one function, and then each visitor can uh, use a different exporter. Okay. And the second implementation detail is uh, where to write the traversal logic, like who will be traversing the whole structure. So there are 3 points where you can do it. One is like you can do it outside, so maybe some iterator, in the case of file hierarchy, you have some file, you have a list of some file, and then you can go through it and call visit over each of the elements. It could also be inside the element itself. So suppose you have a tree structure which have child nodes, and suppose you want to find sum of all the child nodes. So the tree itself can call visit on its children. A node can call visit on its children's. And third is it can also be in visitor. But if you write the traversal logic in visitor, you would have to duplicate this logic for each visitor implementation, right? So suppose you have a regex, you are implementing regex, right? And you have repeat zero or more, or repeat one or many. So in each of these visitors, right, uh, you would have to write like visit uh, uh, some expression, maybe star expression, literal expression. You would have to write this. And so usually when you it's very rare to write the traversal logic in visitor, because uh, you would have to do it when you're doing something very complex, like something your visiting behavior changes when it depends on the output of your visit function. Basically, when you're visiting your files, and suppose file you have reached a criteria where the file sizes that you have accumulated is 1 MB, right? Then maybe you don't want to keep a very accurate estimation of files, so you might just only keep track of megabytes, and you will truncate rest of this stuff. So you would if your visitor if your logic changes depending on the accumulated state, then you will do it. So in the case of regex, when you're doing repeat one or more character logic, then your logic will change if you have visited one character, and your logic will change if you have not find any such character. Then you would have to call repeat many, depending on your regex implementation. Okay. Well, that's all from me, and thank you for listening.